In Las Vegas, alarm clocks didn't just wake tourists for breakfast. They woke them for atomic bombs. Before dawn, hotel rooftops filled with guests wrapped in blankets, coffee steaming in their hands. All eyes turned toward the desert horizon, waiting for the unimaginable, a mushroom cloud crawling skyward in eerie silence before exploding into a fiery crown. Casinos, never ones to waste a spectacle, leaned into the strange new tourism. They sold glowing atomic cocktails, offered themed souvenirs, and hosted rooftop viewing parties where laughter and applause followed the flash of destruction. By today's standards, it sounds like madness, ordinary people cheering as weapons of annihilation lit up the desert sky. But back then, it wasn't terror. It was fascination. The thrill of standing at the edge of the future, watching the atomic age come to life. Meanwhile, Los Angeles wore its post-war boom like a badge of honor. Skyscrapers rose, suburbs spread, and prosperity seemed endless. But by the 1950s, the city had become infamous for something darker. A blanket of smog so thick it burned the eyes and stung the throat. That first mysterious cloud back in 1943 sent panicked crowds running through the streets, believing poison gas had been unleashed. By the mid-50s, the haze was no longer an emergency. It was daily life. Smog alerts became routine, warning schoolchildren to stay inside while the city choked beneath its own progress. Then came 1956. Bulldozers roared to life as the interstate highway system broke ground, a project that would forever reshape America's map. Concrete ribbons stretched across the nation, tying cities together, opening markets, and fueling suburban sprawl. But progress carried a price. Entire neighborhoods, often poor, often minority, were erased. Homes flattened, churches demolished, families uprooted. Highways pulled America closer, but for those standing in their path, they tore entire communities apart. On the driveways of the 1950s, chrome was king. Cars weren't just vehicles. They were rocket ships on wheels, gleaming with futuristic curves, polished so brightly that neighbors could see their own reflections. Weekends became rituals of pride. Families dragged out buckets and sponges, scrubbing white walls, buffing hoods, and waxing every inch until it shined. A wax job wasn't just maintenance, it was a statement. A declaration that you were moving up in the world. Gasoline was cheap, about 20 cents a gallon, the equivalent of just $2.25 today. But filling the tank wasn't a cold, self-serve chore. Uniformed attendants sprinted to your car, greeting you with a smile. They pumped the gas, cleaned the windshield, checked the oil, even topped off the tires, all at no extra charge. It wasn't just fuel. It was an experience, a small ritual of service and pride baked into every stop at the station. Step into a New York City subway car in the 1950s, and you wouldn't find air conditioning or comfort. Cars rattled through the tunnels, ceiling fans whirring, windows cranked open as hot. Stale wind blasted commuters in the face. Sweat and noise weren't inconveniences. They were part of the ride. Relief wouldn't arrive until the 1960s, when air-conditioned trains finally rolled out. For riders of the 50s, summers underground were almost unbearable by today's standards of comfort. Meanwhile, in quiet suburban neighborhoods, DDT fog trucks crept down the streets like parade floats. Children on bicycles chased after them, vanishing into thick white clouds of pesticide mist, laughing and waving as if it were a summer carnival. No masks, no warnings. Just another thrill of the season. Parents barely blinked. This was progress modern science protecting families from mosquitoes, or so they thought. Every December, downtown department stores transformed into glowing winter wonderlands. Crowds pressed against frosted glass to marvel at dazzling Christmas window displays. Miniature trains puffed along tiny tracks. Toy soldiers marched in formation. Santa's elves hammered away in miniature workshops bathed in twinkling lights. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders, their faces glowing in the reflection of glass. For many, those magical windows weren't just decoration. They were the unofficial beginning of the holiday season. And deep inside the government, scientists dreamed bigger and stranger. In the 1950s, Operation Plowshare was born, a vision to use hydrogen bombs not for war, but for peaceful construction. They sketched out grand designs, blasting new harbors into coastlines, carving canals through deserts, even flattening mountains to make way for highways. On paper, it looked like progress, a bold new future shaped by atomic fire. In reality, it was a nuclear fever dream, a reminder of just how casually people once flirted with the power of annihilation. In reality, it was nothing short of a nuclear fever dream, one more reminder of just how casually people once treated the most destructive power on Earth. Fallout. Shelters weren't just doodles in the pages of newspapers. They became a cultural obsession. Families were urged to transform their basements into fortresses of survival, stacking hand-cranked radios beside dosimeters, flashlights, and towers of canned peaches reaching the ceiling. Some households went all in, digging full underground bunkers with reinforced walls and escape hatches. Others simply cleared a corner in the cellar, moved in a few boxes of food, and prayed it would be enough. It was a strange, almost surreal mix Cold War dread and everyday domestic life. Survival plans sitting neatly between the laundry machine and the furnace. Meanwhile, on the streets of San Francisco, cable cars rattled through the fog like carnival rides. With no doors and no seat belts, tourists clung to the sides, snapping photos as the city slipped by beneath their feet. Locals knew to grip the poles tightly as the cars whipped around sharp turns, bells clanging through the mist. It was daily transportation, yes, but also a thrill ride that would make any modern safety inspector faint. On America's highways, another relic of the past lingered: hand signals. Drivers leaned out their windows, arms stretched wide to point left, right, or waving frantically up and down to signal a stop. Many older cars had no blinkers at all. Even by the early 50s, when turn signals became standard on new models, the roads were a chaotic mix of flashing bulbs and human arms flailing in the wind. Pittsburgh, proud of its steel crown, paid the price for its industry. The skies above the city were so heavy with soot that a man's crisp white shirt could turn gray after walking just a few blocks. This wasn't smog, it was ash, clinging to every surface, coating the streets, the windows, even the laundry hung out to dry. Locals joked you could identify a man's trade by the color of his collar. For them, it was a badge of hard work and sacrifice. Traffic deaths, too, became part of the era's grim reality. Cars lacked seat belts, airbags, and crumple zones, yet the highways filled quickly with drivers eager for freedom. Per mile traveled, fatalities were several times higher than today. Newspapers printed accident tallies daily, but it hardly slowed anyone down. Families still piled into cars, windows rolled down, radios humming, believing the risk was worth the reward of the open road. In Las Vegas, the population barely scraped past 25,000 in 1950, but slot machines seemed to outnumber people. They weren't just in casinos. They stood in grocery stores, gas stations, even corner shops. Housewives could slip in a nickel while picking up bread. That all changed in 1955 when Nevada banned slots outside casinos. But for a brief, shining moment, gambling truly was on every corner of the desert boomtown. Car theft? Almost unheard of. Why? Because car keys weren't unique. A single Chevy key might turn the ignition of another Chevy parked down the street. Stories spread of people climbing into what they thought was their car, driving off, and only realizing miles later that they had taken a stranger's vehicle. Today, it sounds absurd. Back then, it was just another quirk of the road. Families who could finally afford shiny new cars often covered the seats in clear plastic slipcovers. The result? In summer, bare legs stuck painfully to the plastic. In winter, wool coats squeaked against it. Nobody liked it, but everyone did it, because nothing said success like a spotless interior. It was a time when protecting the investment mattered even more than enjoying the ride. In the shadows, far from suburbia's shine, the CII was conducting experiments that would later horrify the nation. MK-Ultra, soldiers, prisoners, even unsuspecting civilians were dosed with LSD and other powerful drugs, sometimes without their knowledge, sometimes without consent. All in the name of Cold War mind control. It was bizarre. It was secret. And it would take decades before the public finally learned just how far the program had gone. Meanwhile, Detroit roared with optimism. The Motor City, nicknamed the Arsenal of Democracy during the war, was booming. Factories churned out cars by the thousands, paychecks filled bank accounts, and families snapped up homes in leafy suburbs. Rolling off the assembly lines weren't just automobiles. They were symbols of prosperity, of freedom, of the American dream taking shape in chrome and steel. And while cars promised mobility, cigarettes promised sophistication. Ads didn't whisper about health risks. They shouted endorsements. More doctors smoked Camels than any other cigarette, one campaign declared boldly. Smoking wasn't just common, it was everywhere. In homes, offices, restaurants, even hospitals. By the mid-1950s, over half of adult men smoked. The air itself was hazy, but the habit was considered stylish, even modern. Doctors weren't just handing out cigarettes, they were also prescribing stimulants. Amphetamines, marketed as diet aids or pep pills, became household staples. Housewives took them to keep up with endless chores. Businessmen used them to push through long hours. Addiction risks weren't part of the conversation. To many, they seemed like science distilled into a pill, a shortcut to stamina, with little thought for the consequences of tomorrow. And far to the south, in Florida, the march of progress carved new suburbs out of swampland. Miami's booming neighborhoods rose where wetlands once sprawled. Swamps were drained, reshaped, and tamed into tidy grids of pastel houses. Mosquitoes swarmed, hurricanes threatened, and canals sliced through backyards. But to middle-class Americans, this was paradise sunshine, palm trees, and the promise of a better life, built atop land borrowed from the Everglades. Builders laid down neat rows of pastel homes where alligators once roamed. Entire swamps were drained, canals carved through backyards, and the air buzzed thick with mosquitoes. Hurricanes loomed every season, reminders of how fragile this new paradise really was. But families moved in anyway. For middle-class Americans, a patch of Florida sunshine felt like a dream finally made real. White picket fences, palm trees, and backyard barbecues all sitting on land borrowed from the Everglades. Yet the 1950s weren't paradise for everyone. Many banks flatly refused to give married women a mortgage or even a credit card without their husband's signature. It wasn't written into law. It was discrimination baked into everyday life. Women could have jobs, open bank accounts, even save money. But when it came to credit, they were treated as dependents, not individuals. This practice would continue for decades, until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act finally outlawed it in 1974. In classrooms across America, prayer and Bible readings were part of the morning routine. Students bowed their heads, teachers led the verses, and in 1954, the phrase "under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. By 1956, "In God We Trust" was adopted as the official national motto. At the time, it felt natural, an expression of identity during the Cold War. Today, such routines would spark lawsuits and headlines, but in the 1950s, they were woven into daily life. In apartment buildings, garbage didn't always wait for the city to collect it. Instead, superintendents shoveled it into roaring basement incinerators. Smoke drifted up chimneys, leaving behind a distinct smell that clung to city air. By modern standards, it seems reckless burning trash inside the very building where people lived. But back then, it was just another rhythm of urban living, another background detail that most residents barely noticed. Even the gadgets of the atomic age carried hidden dangers. Wristwatches painted with glowing radium dials lit up the dark with a greenish hue. Uranium glass glowed under blacklight, and the brilliant orange glaze on Fiesta dinnerware carried traces of radiation. Families ate soup out of glowing bowls and never thought twice about it. To them, it wasn't a hazard. It was progress. A little bit of modern science served right on the dinner table. Medicine, too, felt more personal. In the 1950s, doctors still made house calls. A physician might arrive at the front door with a black bag in hand, take a seat at the kitchen table, and scribble notes onto a handwritten chart. Fees were tucked discreetly into envelopes. Malpractice suits were rare. Families trusted the doctor's word completely, whether the prescription was for antibiotics or simply rest and fluids. Medicine came to your door instead of the other way around. Across America, volunteers peered into the skies with binoculars as part of the Ground Observer Corps. Retirees, teachers, even school children sat in wooden watchtowers, telephones ready to report unidentified aircraft. It was a Cold War precaution that feels almost quaint today. But at the time, it felt patriotic and active service to the nation, a way for ordinary citizens to join the front lines of vigilance. Air travel, too, carried its own unique character. Step inside a 1950s airliner, and you'd find a smoky, noisy space. Passengers lit cigarettes right in their seats. Ashtrays rattled as flight attendants, then called stewardesses, pushed coffee carts down narrow aisles. Turbulence sent drinks sloshing and elbows bumping, but nobody filed lawsuits. Flying was glamorous, yes, but also rough around the edges. Loud engines, thin cushions, cramped cabins, and a complimentary matchbook tucked into every seat pocket. Back on the ground, the GI Bill sparked an unprecedented housing boom. Suburbs exploded across the country, filled with endless rows of identical homes. Levittown, with its neat Cape Cod houses and manicured lawns, became the poster child for post-war prosperity. For veterans returning from the war, it wasn't just a house. It was a promise of stability, a symbol of success, and the physical foundation of the American dream. Some prefabricated homes from the late 1940s still stood in the suburbs, quiet reminders of rationing days and wartime necessity. They weren't glamorous, but they symbolized a nation in transition, practical housing solutions left over from an era when materials were scarce and families simply needed a roof over their heads. By the 1950s, though, the mood was shifting. It was an era when the dream of homeownership felt closer than ever, almost within reach for the average family. For the first time, people who had grown up in crowded apartments or shared homes during the Depression could imagine a house of their own, with a lawn, a driveway, and maybe even a garage. In the early 1950s, a family flipping through a magazine might spot an ad for a pistol or rifle, fill out a form, and order it by mail. Days later, the gun would arrive right at their doorstep. No federal background checks, no waiting periods, no paperwork, just cash slipped into an envelope. Today, it sounds reckless, unthinkable, even. But back then, it was simply commerce. Firearms were marketed and sold like any other household product, advertised alongside vacuum cleaners and radios. Family vacations reflected the same mix of freedom and risk. Families packed themselves into one car for long road trips. Seat belts weren't required, and most cars didn't even have them. Kids sprawled across laps in the front seat, the family dog panting happily in the back, windows rolled down against the summer heat. Hours on the road passed with license plate games, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and the constant hum of the radio. It was noisy, crowded, and undeniably dangerous, but it was also the heartbeat of American family life, a rolling adventure on four wheels. Classrooms in the 1950s carried their own atmosphere, quite literally. Chalk dust hung in the air, and sometimes tobacco smoke, too. Teachers read stories with a cigarette perched on the edge of an ashtray, pausing between pages to tap the ash away. Parents didn't complain. It was considered normal. The classroom felt orderly, authoritative, and familiar, even if the haze of smoke and chalk lingered long after the final bell rang. Meanwhile, science was working its way into the kitchen. Pressure cookers were advertised as miracle machines, promising meals in minutes. Housewives were encouraged to prepare roasts or hearty soups faster than ever before. But those shiny new appliances came with hidden risks. Faulty seals sometimes sent lids rocketing off and sprayed dinner across the ceiling in a mini explosion. Despite the danger, pressure cookers became staples of the 1950s kitchen part wonder, part worry, and another symbol of how modern science was reshaping daily life. Beyond the kitchen, Girl Scouts sold cookies the old-fashioned way, door to door. Dressed in green sashes, they lugged waxed paper boxes and clipboards of order sheets, knocking on neighbors' doors with bright smiles. The flavors were simple shortbreads, sandwich cookies. But the ritual mattered more than the choices. Neighbors bought a box or two, not for the cookies themselves, but for the sense of community, for the chance to support the girls down the street. Before cable television became a household word, some small towns pioneered their own grassroots version, community antenna television. A tall hilltop antenna captured the faint broadcast signal, and coaxial lines carried it into dozens of homes. Families chipped in for the service, sharing one signal as though it belonged to the whole neighborhood. It was a practical solution for families living in TV dead zones, and another reminder of how resourceful communities could be. Trust among neighbors was just as strong. Many families left spare keys under doormats, tucked inside flower pots, or hanging openly on a nail in the garage. It was understood if someone needed to borrow sugar or stop by to water the plants, they could simply let themselves in. Burglaries were rare. Hiding keys in plain sight wasn't foolish. It was perfectly reasonable, because communities were bound together by trust. On dinner tables, Jell-O molds reigned supreme. Meats, vegetables, even hard-boiled eggs could be suspended inside glistening rings of colorful gelatin. To us today, it seems bizarre, even unappetizing. But in the 1950s, it was high fashion in food. Guests admired the shimmer. Homemakers beamed with pride. Everyone dug in with a smile. To them, it wasn't strange, it was elegance, made edible. And beside the stove, a coffee tin of bacon grease was a common sight in kitchens across America. Nothing went to waste. That jar of fat-fried eggs in the morning, flavored biscuits in the afternoon, and seasoned vegetables for supper. The aroma of bacon carried through the week, stretching Sunday's breakfast into days of hearty meals. It was thrift, tradition, and flavor, all saved in a simple tin can by the burner. It was thrift, flavor, and tradition, all saved in a simple tin can by the stove. Every spoonful of bacon grease carried with it the memory of Sunday breakfast, stretched into the week ahead. In many small towns, grocery stores closed at noon every Wednesday for a half day. Shopkeepers needed rest, and customers respected the rhythm. Families planned errands carefully, knowing that by midweek the aisles would go dark. In today's 24/7 America, it feels unimaginable. But in the 1950s, it was perfectly normal for communities to pause, breathe, and let their shopkeepers catch a break. Many garages of the era had open grease pits dug straight into the floor. They let car owners climb beneath their vehicles without ramps or hydraulic lifts. Practical, yes, but also dangerous. Children sometimes played too close. Accidents happened, and eventually safety codes banned them. But in the 1950s, grease pits were simply part of the American garage. Messy, risky, and undeniably useful. Coal was still king in working-class towns. Many homes had basement chutes that opened right onto the street, where deliverymen dumped coal by the shovelful. It fueled furnaces for the long winter ahead, filling homes with warmth. Soot and dust coated everything: clothes, curtains, windowsills. But for a child, that coal chute was magic. It looked like a secret tunnel, a forbidden passage into the hidden corners of the house. At diners, raw eggs weren't just for frying. They were cracked directly into milkshakes called egg creams or strength drinks. Packed, supposedly, with protein, they were gulped down with no concern for salmonella or pasteurization. The egg became part of the show, cracked with flair by the soda jerk, swallowed by eager customers who believed it made their milkshake more powerful. Shopkeepers often turned to neighborhood kids for odd jobs, sweeping sidewalks, stacking crates, or delivering small packages. Payment was simple: a nickel, a dime, maybe even a free soda. It wasn't just pocket change. It was trust. Kids learned responsibility. Merchants got a helping hand. And the arrangement stitched small towns together. Today, it might raise eyebrows. Back then, it just worked. On late-night highways, patrol officers handled drunk driving differently than today. A weaving driver might be stopped, spoken to, and simply waved home. Sleep it off carried more weight than handcuffs. It was seen as a warning, not a crime. Today, the thought is shocking. But in the 1950s, drunk driving often ended with a handshake instead of charges. Even cars themselves told the story of transition. Early 1950s models still relied on starter buttons near the floorboard, pressed by foot to fire the engine. By mid-decade, key ignitions took over. For a while, the roads were filled with both systems side by side, one fading into the other. It was another small step toward making cars feel futuristic progress sitting right in the driver's seat. In rural towns, hardware and farm supply stores often carried dynamite caps and fuses, no license required. Farmers bought them to blast out tree stumps or break apart stubborn rocks. Boxes of explosives sat casually on shed shelves next to nails and hammers. Dangerous, yes, but in the 1950s, they were considered just another farm supply. Every new car rolled off the showroom floor with two guarantees: a cigarette lighter and a full-size spare tire. These features were as expected as the steering wheel. Over time, priorities shifted. Lighters gave way to cup holders. Spare tires shrank or vanished altogether. But in the 1950s, both were standard, reminders of what mattered most to drivers of that age. Even schools reflected the era's approach to waste. Many burned their trash on site basement incinerators, glowing with scraps of paper, or barrels smoking in playground backlots. Paper, lunch trays, even broken desks went into the flames. The smoke drifted across schoolyards, mingling with chalk dust and coal soot. Nobody thought twice. Waste pickup wasn't reliable, and burning felt practical. And when it came to food storage, many families didn't yet have the luxury of home freezers. Instead, they rented freezer lockers at the local butcher shop. Paper-wrapped cuts of meat were stored in private compartments, unlocked like little bank vaults when families came by. By the late 50s, home freezers began to spread, and the practice faded into memory. But for a time, America's frozen food didn't live in kitchens. It lived in the butcher's back room.